The city of Washington, known for its history of nonviolent expression, is watching and waiting. A handful of white nationalists, just 24, gathered within sight of the White House earlier. Thousands more met them head-on during a rainy night here in the nation's capital. And I want to start with our team of reporters that has been out in the rain all day and night. I want to start with Garrett Haake. Garrett, you started your day at the Metro meeting this small group of protesters. Frankly, can you just walk us through what you've seen over the course of today?
Sure, Casey, it was clear from the word go that this rally was not going to be everything that it was advertised as. When organizers put it together, they had told people to meet at the Metro in Vienna, Virginia around 2 o'clock so they could come into the city as a big group in a show of force and for their own protection. They got their protection from MPD once they made it into the District of Columbia, but there was no show of force. Only about 24 or so folks under the banner of Jason Kessler, who is the organizer of this event in Charlottesville last year, and once again doing this Unite the Right Rally 2.0 here in D.C. today. The disorganization, the disunity, the lack of message was clear from the start. Most of these folks showed up. They didn't even have Metro cards. So they marched into the Vienna Metro station and then marched right up to the Metro card machine and had to slow themselves down to buy fare to get into the district. And the message was muddled from the word go as well. Kessler tried to tell me in an interview that this was not a racist event, that this was all about free speech. Then I started talking to some of the people who'd showed up with them, and two young white supremacists, there's really no other word for it, told me they considered white Americans to be the founding stock of this country, and that if you weren't a white European American, you were somehow less American than they. So no message unity. The ride in on the train was probably the highlight of the day for these guys because they had the press attention to themselves, and when they got into the city, they were completely and utterly overwhelmed by the thousands of counter-protesters that swarmed them every step of the way from the Metro here to Lafayette Park behind me and stayed with them all day long until they left.
Garrett, can I ask you, I've seen some traffic and some people, frankly, raising questions about whether these white nationalists were given separate cars on the Metro to bring them in to Washington, D.C. Since you were there, I mean, what did you see?
I was on the train. There was a car that was entirely white nationalists and reporters, but I don't know that that was done in the direction of anyone except people on the platform who also looked around and decided they didn't want to be in a Metro car full of white nationalists and reporters. There were other people on that train coming in from Vienna, but they were riding in different cars. It's not clear to me that that was done at the direction of police, rather just some good, sensible Virginians who looked around and said there's probably another car on this train they'd rather ride in.
Said I absolutely want to be no part of this. Okay, Garrett, thank you. Jeff Bennett, can you talk us through what you've seen from your vantage point? And also, obviously, after this happened in Charlottesville just 1 year ago, all the attention turned to President Trump and his really response or lack thereof to what we had seen in the streets of Charlottesville. How are things different this year?
Casey, you're 100% right. And look, Jason Kessler, the organizer behind Unite the Right, the rally last year and this sequel rally, initially wanted to hold the follow-up in Charlottesville, but he was denied a permit there. So he then turned his attention to Washington, D.C., and the National Park Service approved his permit for what he called a white civil rights rally because the National Park Service says that they are forced to approve any First Amendment rights event. So he thought he was going to be coming, in closer proximity to President Trump, even though this is a weekend in which we know President Trump is at his private golf resort in Bedminster, where he's finishing up his week there. But we've seen the president just yesterday sort of issue that preemptive tweet where he says, I condemn racism on all sides. And so some people have really characterized that standing in stark contrast to what he said last year, where he drew this moral equivalence between the white nationalists, the white supremacists, and those who are protesting against him. However, some people have read that same tweet and said, look, the president still can't condemn these white supremacists. He can't call out their bad acts. So we have this tweet from the president today. Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter and White House aide, added her voice to all of this, saying that she condemns specifically racism, white nationalism, Nazism, says it has no place in our country. So the question is, What will the president say when he's in an unguarded, unscripted moment and he gets a question about this? Whether it's an Oval Office spray, whether it's a South Lawn scrum, whether he's going to do an event tomorrow. There will be some press pool reporters there. What will he say when he's caught off guard? I think that will be far more illustrative and far more instructive. Casey.
And we should note, of course, Jeff, that permit that you mentioned that was given to Mr. Kessler was for upwards of 400 people. He showed up with just 24. Jeff Bennett, thanks very much for your reporting. We'll be checking back in with you tonight.
Sure.
Meanwhile, I want to welcome in my panel here with me on set, former RNC chairman and MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele, White House reporter for the LA Times and MSNBC political analyst Eli Stokols, Democratic pollster and MSNBC political analyst Cornell Belcher, and the president of the National Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Michael Steele, I want to start with you as somebody who is, there's a lot being ascribed to what I think is still your party, although you have had some major differences over the course of the last year.
We're working that out.
But what do you read into what you saw today with this, frankly, dismal showing, and what the president has had to say about it so far?
Well, I kind of ignore the showing and all of that because that's melodrama that will play itself out one way or the other. 24 people, 400 people, that is what it is. How that's ultimately framed, in my view, is what we have relied on in the past, and that is a president who speaks into the moment and clarifies and defines where we are as American citizens when it comes to this type of hate-filled response to fellow Americans. And the fact that the president is giving us sort of a lightweight response on Twitter, the way he's, there's hate racism of all kinds. Okay, yeah, but we're specifically talking about this, all right? Can you narrow it down for us just a little bit with respect to what's happening in your front yard? And the fact that he still can't do that, that to me is the lesson that every American should take from what we see this weekend. Mark
Morial, to Michael Steele's point, the president is not out front leading on this tonight.
The rally by the Unite the Right group was an absolute flop, a failure, a poor showing. 30 people, and all of this anticipation, all of this mobilization, all of the public resources spent by the city of Washington and the federal government and the taxpayers for 30 people to show up. But secondly, this was an opportunity for the president to make a forceful, unequivocal statement. Go look at Mitt Romney's statement. Look at Ivanka Trump's statement. Those statements are more on mark of the type of statement we'd like to see the president make. This is a moral moment. This is a moment where we expect the president to speak unequivocally. He seems to not be able to really get to the point where he condemns this awful ideology of white supremacy, white nationalism, wrapped in the embers of Nazism and anti-Semitism. We want and need our president to lead on this moral issue at this very difficult and challenging time in American history. We haven't heard that, and I think we should hear it.
Cornell Belcher, first of all, your perspective on what we've seen unfold in the streets of Washington today, and what kind of lasting damage might President Trump be doing to Republican relationships with the GOP for African Americans who are thinking about where can I have a home?
Right. No, and where can I have a home is a big issue. We've seen in a lot of polling and CBS polling, and we did polling in battlegrounds for African Americans for Black PAC, and you have over 70% of African Americans thinking that racism is on the rise, right? So and a majority think that their communities are under attack. So that's the sort of reality it is for minorities, for many minorities who thought so much of this was in the past. Right now, we're again watching, Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists march through the streets of Washington, right? But I also, at the same time, to the chairman's point on this, the 30 people showing it doesn't mean anything, right? Because we understand as a strategy they're going underground, and when you look at sort of the racism that I think Trump is making okay again in this country, that's going to hurt us long term. Because one of the things I've talked about before is we're not going to get whiter as a country. So we better figure out how to live with each other, whether you're Republican or Democrat. We've got to do a better job of figuring out how to live with each other, and the president must play a central role in that.
Yeah, Eli Stokols, from a political perspective, I mean, this is a president who feeds off crowds. He watches what happens in front of him. He tosses things out to the crowd. He sees how they react to it. And oftentimes he'll continue to say something because it seemed to resonate. It doesn't seem to me that this small group of extremists really had any sort of showing that should suggest that this is something with a real constituency.
No, if he's watching TV tonight, and we have no reason to think that he's not, because he watches TV pretty much every day. He's seeing this, and he is not going to want to. He's not going to take satisfaction. He's not going to claim credit. If anything, he might distance himself from it. But before he could see the crowds, as everybody here has pointed out, he had a chance to make a strong statement condemning not all kinds of racism, but specifically white supremacism. He did not do that. And for better or for worse, you know, the White House and the president is really good at giving these kind of mealy-mouthed statements that are open to interpretation. So he can say, I condemned racism. What do you want me to do? But he can leave enough room there for people who want to march in these rallies or attend these meetings or pop off on Facebook with racist ideas. He can leave enough daylight for them to think he's actually with us. That protest that we saw in Charlottesville a year ago, that hadn't been seen before Donald Trump was president. And from all the reporters who were in the crowd talking to people, the majority of the white supremacists who showed up believed, rightly or wrongly, that this president was on their side, that he understood them differently than past presidents, past political leaders before, and there was an excitement about that. And if that is not the case, it's incumbent on the president to send a stronger message to say, I do not support this, and as yet he has not.
Michael Steele, this is a question that Chuck Todd asked of a member of Congress on Meet the Press a week or two ago. He asked, you know, is the Republican Party becoming a party that is fundamentally anti-black?
I won't know if I'll go that far yet. We have our roots, though. I mean, we have our roots when there was a Southern strategy from the Nixon campaign in '68 to bring into the fold this particular ilk of person, to put it politely, this kind of trash, because there was some electoral benefit, presumably, that would come from it. There was no consideration given to the poison that would infect the body politic within the GOP, that here we are now, some 50 years later, having to deal with a president, a Republican president, who, to you know, the point that was just made, gives countenance to it, that gives room to that. So the party has to now, irrespective of the president, the party has to account for this. Because I don't know how we go into a black community, into a Hispanic community, and say, come, join us, be a part of us. It's not enough to say you're conservative. It's not enough to say you go to church on Sundays. It's not enough to put all that out there on the table anymore. When you've got this body of work by this administration, you've got the rhetoric and everything else that says something very different to communities of color in this country. And it's a real problem.
Mark Morial, jump in.
I want to offer, yes. So I think it's an interesting arc, if you will, from George Bush circa 2001, talking about affirmative access, appointing Colin Powell and later Condoleezza Rice as secretaries of state, a GOP in the Congress that had a J.C. Watts in its leadership, and a GOP that had a Michael Steele as its chair. That party, which seemed to be maybe making small steps, is a very different scene today. A Michael Steele, a J.C. Watts, a Colin Powell, a Condi Rice, they were prominent in the Republican movement of the early 2000s. Now you see something very different. This is a directional shift when you've got a Corey Stewart, a Patrick Little, as candidates nominated or candidates running under the GOP banner. So I think the difficulty for the GOP is not only in its leadership optics and in the president's rhetoric, but also the fact that there are no longer any credible African Americans in any leadership role anywhere, it seems, in the Congress or in the executive branch. It's hard to make up, particularly when you've got a changing landscape in the country, not to even mention the lack of Latino leaders in the very same party. So you've got to look at this in terms of where it's come from maybe 15 years ago to where it is. It's directionally in the wrong direction if you consider the demographic shifts in the country for the GOP.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.